In this lesson, we'll talk about India, and at the end, a little bit about the legacy of imperialism. The first Europeans to establish commercial ties with India were the Portuguese. Vasco da Gama landed at Calcutta in 1498 and set up a post in order to conduct trade with the rest of the continent. Commodities of greatest interest to the Portuguese were spices, which they could make handsome profits reselling in Europe. In 1615, King James I of England ordered Sir Thomas Roe to visit India to meet with Jahangir, the Mughal emperor. At this time, the Mughals controlled nearly 3/4 of the land of India. James I hoped to secure exclusive trading rights for the British East India Company. Roe successfully negotiated these rights, and the British East India Company was granted a monopoly over trade in India, gaining control of India's supply of raw materials, including tea, indigo, coffee, and cotton. Later we'll see opium. The British hoped to gain considerable profits from their control of the Indian economy. To ensure that they profited from controlling trade with India, the British often pushed farmers to grow cash crops, such as cotton and tea. Although many farmers acceded to Britain's request and grew the cash crops, they didn't end up sharing in the profits. Furthermore, because the farmers had devoted their lands to growing non-edible rather than edible crops, they soon found that they often couldn't procure enough food to feed their families. You just can't eat cotton. In 1756, Suraj Dowlah became Nabub of the Bengal region of India. Previous regimes had accepted a treaty with the British East India Company that had given the company control of the city of Calcutta. Unlike his predecessors, however, Dowlah ignored the treaty, took over Calcutta, and imprisoned employees of the British East India Company. Dowlah had the support of the French, who were battling the English for control of the trade with Bengal. The British responded by sending an army commanded by Robert Clive. In this decisive Battle of Plassey in 1757, a badly outnumbered Clive managed to defeat the Nabob's army. Clive's victory not only gave the British control of Bengal, but also drove the French from the region for good and effectively eliminated French trade with India as a whole. This battle essentially consolidated British control over most of India, and the East India Company began to make improvements to India's infrastructure in order to connect the interior of the country with the port cities on the coast. So you see, Britain is very well invested in India. They'll fight for it, they'll invest in it. Improvements in India's infrastructure. The British made all these improvements to India's infrastructure in order to facilitate the export of goods and also to solidify their economic and political control of the region. We're talking about bridges, canals, dams, telephones, roads, the third largest railroad system in the world at the time. The Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoys were Indian troops that served under the British Army. In 1857, the British issued new ammunition to the Sepoys. The new cartridges had to be bitten off before they could be used. However, the cartridges were greased in beef and pork fat. Most of the Sepoys were Hindus or Muslims. Since cows are sacred to Hindus and pork is forbidden for Muslims, the Sepoys refused to use the new ammunition. General discontent with the increasing British domination over India turned the incident into a full-scale rebellion. Intense fighting often broke out, and it took the British 10 months to put down the uprising. Soon after that, in the spring of 1858, the British Crown used the rebellion as an excuse to take political and economic control of India. So you can see the imperialism in India was not just economic, it was also cultural. In 1858, the British abolished the East India Company and placed all of India under the direct control of the British Crown. India proved to be the most profitable of all Britain's colonies and was often referred to as the jewel in the crown of England. If you look at this map, you can see all the British possessions. Even the United States used to be a British possession before we rebelled. French Indochina in 1858. French and Spanish-led forces entered Vietnam following the death of several Christian missionaries there. Within a decade, France had conquered all of southern Vietnam. They referred to this new imperial possession as Cochinchina. In 1882, the French seized the northern Vietnamese city of Hanoi, which provoked a war with China. France emerged victorious from the conflict and soon gained supremacy in the region, securing Tonkin, that's in northern Vietnam. Cambodia and Laos all fell under French control. Thailand was the only Southeast Asian country that avoided coming under European control. You can see here in the map where Thailand is. Hanoi served as the capital of the French Indochina. The French controlled the region from approximately 1887 until 1954. During that period, they installed a number of puppet emperors. The French improved public services in Indochina, but only to the degree that such improvements would benefit colonial control. Economically, Vietnam provided France with tin, pepper, coal, cotton, and rice. Burma. Britain and the country of Burma fought 3 wars in the 19th century, with the British prevailing each time. Britain had little interest in the country as a colonial possession, but ended up in armed conflicts with the Burmese largely to protect its dominance in the region and to protect the borders of India, its most valuable country. After the First War in 1824 to 1826, Burma was forced to cede several provinces. After the Second War in 1852 to 1853, Britain assumed control of the entire southern half of Burma. In 1885, the British took just a week to rout the Burmese forces. Then on January 1st, 1886, they annexed Burma to India. Here's some discussion questions. But I want to save those for the end. I want to talk about the legacy of imperialism to end the whole unit. Imperialism is one of the factors that caused World War I. It had a lot of economic consequences, and it affected the third world nations. Remember, in India, they had to grow cash crops, so they were starving because they couldn't grow food to eat. So we're going to talk about some of the effects of imperialism. Let's start with World War I. Imperialism was clearly a contributing cause of World War I. The competition for overseas possessions often brought European powers into conflict. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Germany became more and more aggressive in its quest for imperial possessions abroad. In 1905, the leading imperial powers acceded to Germany's demands for a conference to dispute French control of Morocco. Though Germany gained nothing, other nations began to view Germany as a threat to stability in Europe. Britain and France had vied for control of affairs in Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. It was not until the Anglo-French Entente in 1904 that the two nations finally settled their colonial disputes. Many of the entangling alliances that historians often cite as a primer cause for the World War I actually came out of the result of imperialism conflicts. So how did Europe get in these massive alliances? Well, it was because of imperialism. Economic consequences. Long-term dependence on cash crops had a negative impact on the economies of imperial possessions. Most of these crops depleted the soil and made it difficult to grow subsistence crops to live on. Cash crops also tended to undermine local industries because they sucked up most of the labor. In addition, Once colonies gained their independence, years of dependence on a single cash crop made it difficult to modernize and diversify their economies. So it really kept people down. Third world nations. The rise of nationalism in Europe was largely a 19th century phenomenon, and it contributed to the spread of imperialism. Before falling under European control, many third world peoples had a set political boundaries and drawn their sense of identity from shared tribal or cultural traits. For them, the concept of nation didn't really exist. That began to change under imperialism. European powers created national borders almost arbitrarily, often forcing ethnic groups with no common language or tradition, and sometimes a shared history of conflict, to live together under the same colonial authority. For example, the borders Europeans drew to define the country of Nigeria encompassed four major ethnic groups: the Hausa, who made up about one-fifth of the population; the Yoruba, who made up another fifth; the Ibu, less than 20%; and the Fulani, about 10%. In addition, the area was home to hundreds of smaller ethnic groups. Nearly all these ethnic groups resented having these artificial boundaries forced upon them. This shared discontent and mutual resentment of European occupiers created an incipient sense of nationalism among these diverse people. They thought, we're different than them. We should be our own people. We should be independent. This is nationalism, seeing the world as us and thems. Legacy of imperialism. Although many colonies benefited from the improvements imperialism brought to infrastructure, schooling and healthcare, political stability, economic lacking, and diversity continued to plague many former colonies. Many nations in Africa have experienced and continue to experience civil war resulting in large part from the artificial boundaries that remained after they had won their independence from the former European powers. Most colonies had little experience with self-rule. When independence came, political instability often followed. When stability was achieved, many times it came because a dictator had seized control of the country. Imperialism more or less created the Third World, and many of the problems that these countries experience today stem from the legacy of European imperialism. That is the end of the unit on imperialism.